Okay, hi everyone. Welcome to Talent Collective session on pay equity. For those of you that I haven't had a chance to meet yet, my name is Tammy Dane. I'm one of the original co-founders of Talent Collective, and I'm also the CEO and founder at Rabble Recruiting based in San Francisco in the Bay Area. What we do, if you haven't heard of us, is on-demand recruiting HR and ops professionals of all levels. One of the funnest things that takes me away from that work is getting to host workshops like this on occasion. I am so excited that we're here with Kadie Philp to talk about pay equity, something that is so important for us to discuss. So I cannot wait to dive in. If you haven't met Kadie, she is a seasoned executive who has worked with over 100 cities from 30 countries to design and deliver inclusive economic growth strategies. So in short, a true expert on today's topic. So I can't wait to hear a little bit more from her and to give us even more of a robust introduction on her background. Before I turn it over in just a few minutes here, I want to go over the kind of format for today because we have a unique workshop. We have both members of Talent Collective on today's session, and we also have just the public, folks who found us and were really interested in the topic. So please note that everyone is welcome to join for these first 45 minutes. So if you're on Pacific time, that's till 11:45 Pacific time. And then we're going to take a 5-minute break. And then we're going to launch into a 30-minute member-only Q&A with Kadie. So if you're a Talent Collective member, please don't forget to hop back on for your exclusive Q&A session with Kadie at 11:50 Pacific time. I'll obviously remind all of you about this before we break for the session, but wanted to have that in the back of your mind. And if you are a member, you will be going back to the Talent Collective page to access your exclusive link to rejoin us at 11:50. All right, without further ado, let me go ahead and turn it over to Kadie. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. And it was really wonderful to be with you in Toronto when you did your launch here. I spoke as a panelist, and it was a really great community. I don't want to spend too much time talking about myself, but I want to hit on the topic today and the title, Floors and Ceilings, Labor Market Dynamics for Women, because we often see information when we talk about the pay gap, that the gender wage gap. We're going to talk about all the nuances, and especially, the top 3 historical reasons that have typically justified pay gaps, what's happening today to address them, and then top trends, I think, for people, working women, but also women or anybody in the recruiting space should be thinking about. But you often hear in the gender wage gap discussion that the wage gaps are much higher at the top, at the CEO or CFO, like C-suite level, or management and senior management level. And, as an economist and somebody who works with labor market data and economics data, that's not a surprising thing. It's not even really an interesting thing, because our labor markets have floors. We create floors with legislation, which is called a minimum wage. So we have minimum wage standards. We have base standards. We don't set ceilings. We don't, governments don't say, you can't pay an executive or senior management or senior C-suite this maximum amount. So it's pretty clear that there's going to be more discrepancy at the top because there's no ceiling set. The sky is the limit. As you get closer to the bottom and the lower level in the labor market, you're seeing less inequality because there's a floor, because there is a minimum wage set. So we're going to talk about all of that in sort of the messy middle. But just to start off, for some relevancy for the US, the annual analysis of Census Bureau across the US shows that the pay gap costs women 1.6 trillion a year in the US. And that's a huge economic cost to women. It is a huge economic cost, lost opportunity cost for the economy. Like there's just a lot here from the individual micro level to the macro level of actually growing your economy by having consumers being more empowered to invest, to spend, to save. And this is really relevant because, the purchasing power of women in the US is 5 trillion to 15 trillion annually. That's a big spread. But women, when they have money, they invest money and they spend money. So it's good for them. It's good for the economy. So this is sort of, the economic placement of this, of closing wage gaps argument, which, most people want to hear the economic argument. Really briefly about what I do. I'm the Pay Equity Commissioner of Ontario's Pay Equity Commission. We were the first government globally to have a Pay Equity Act. We've been in force, our act has been in force. It's a legislation that says employers have to do a pay equity analysis. And if they don't, we can enforce it. We've been in force for over like 35 or 37, 38 years. So we were the first globally, and we do a lot to educate other governments on how they can create policy and legislation and programs that support women in the labor market. I won't spend too much on what we actually do. What's more interesting, I think, especially because I'm assuming there's a lot of folks on the call from the US. And, we have a very different definition of pay equity in Ontario and a couple of other countries globally. So equal pay for equal work is one concept that is pretty ubiquitous. All US states have this. The US passed this law, I think, in the 60s. That you basically have to pay people doing the same job the same amount of money, obviously with ranges, with acceptable ranges, accounting for differences in education, tenure, these types of things. But there's essentially, a floor, maybe even a little bit of a ceiling set in these contexts to say that there's an acceptable range of variance, but there's equal pay for equal work. What pay equity does, and what our office focuses on, is pay equity, which is equal pay for work of equal value. So this really acknowledges the historic undervaluation of work that has typically been done by women. And we'll talk about this in a few minutes, and how that has systemically created a problem of underpaying work that is primarily and stereotypically, like historically done by women, stereotypically and primarily still done by women. We've undervalued the contribution that work gives in the labor market, and so it's undervalued in compensation. So the Act requires employers to go through a gender-neutral job comparator system to find, a points value. It's very technical, I won't get into it, to find the value a job provides, to make sure that there's not a difference in compensation comparably to male-dominated jobs just because of gender. So I'll get into that and bring some clarity to that statement as I go through, kind of the top 3 historical reasons the gender pay gap exists. So number one, if I had more time, I would take you back, 10, 20,000 years ago, when we were, in fact, before the agricultural revolution, men and women were pretty much equal economic contributors. And really the only economic activity of that our, tribal nomadic selves was gathering food. And it's more accurate to say that we were gatherers and hunters because the primary activity at the time was gathering food. Hunting was a very rare, more seasonal occasion. It wasn't a daily thing. And women were the primary gatherers. And so, the proverbial nuts and seeds and flowers and all these edible things. So women and men contributed equally in that process and in that economic, growth of their community and survival of their community. There's a really famous quote by Dr. Deborah Spar. She's a anthropologist out of the US, and she said, patriarchy began with the plow. Because with the creation of the plow and agriculture, we started to see a very gender segregated, domesticated working environment where, women primarily, well, actually it was women who remarkably kind of invented the agricultural processes, which we don't celebrate enough, but they started being more, segregated into the home, into the domestic space that was now being created as a new phenomenon. And, regrettably, women at this time became more or less property of, or the idea, this equality shift towards now control and command, because women produced labor, which were children. And the only way to work a farm is to have people who could do it. And tragically, slavery arrives at this time. And so does really the subjugation of women to say, she's producing labor, she's producing children on my land, and I have to own and control that. So the whole social dynamics changed with the introduction of the plow, and this idea that women belong in and are constructed now into this space in the home, or this kind of evolving agrarian society. I'm going to jump a couple thousand years. If we had time, I'd love to take you along the whole trajectory of those sort of gendered work dynamics that change. But we don't have a lot of time, so I want to bring you to the Industrial Revolution, which is really another huge marker for women in the labor market and the labor market dynamics. So remarkably enough, at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, it was primarily women and children that went to work in factories because of the way that the machines were designed, and the sort of demand for like dexterity and the ability to use these machines. And as men started to realize, like, there was no, think about it, before the Industrial Revolution, there was no really massive paid labor market like we see today. People primarily worked in homesteads or family kind of community-based settings. There was still a lot of barter and trade. And that's a tough living. I don't know if any of you come from farming communities. That is a tough go. My husband was a cattle farmer growing up, and even in, the 80s and 90s, it's very tough. So if you can imagine, these men are looking at these women who leave the house and go work, and they are bringing home more money because it's really hard. You don't know when you bring a cow to the market if it's even going to sell and what your price is going to be. Or if you've worked really hard, your wife has made, or your spouse has made cheese, and you're bringing it to market, if you're even going to sell it, or if you have to toss it because it's gone. So it created this sort of gender dynamic where men started to realize, hey, the better jobs are actually in manufacturing plants. And you start to see an increase of men coming to the industrial workforce, and you start to see the machinery becoming larger and more demanding, requiring more men to come into the space. So again, there's a shift there that happens. And because of sort of social mores and ideas of where women should and shouldn't be, at the time, it was actually primarily unmarried women that were able to enter the labor market. And both Canada and the US had basically marriage bans. So if women got married, they were no longer allowed to work. They had laws up until, in some states, the laws on the types of jobs women could do. They labeled them as protective laws, but this idea that saying, like, women couldn't work in laundries because it didn't work for their, physical sensibilities, or women couldn't work in mining, or these things that required like heavy equipment on trains and rails, all of these things, because it just didn't work with our bodies or sensibilities, which is sort of outrageous. So there was this construction of a highly gender segregated labor market based on social mores. And the prevailing view at the time was that women didn't need to make as much money as men, because if they were unmarried, they probably still lived with their parents and didn't need much money. And if they were married in the labor market, which was rare because they shouldn't be in the labor market, they didn't need to make much money because they had a husband providing for them. Even until the 1960s, they were, even in Canada, there were married women's wages. So there was a difference between unmarried and married women's wages in the labor market. And this was seen across the US as well. And we also had marriage bars, as I mentioned, where women, once they were married, had to leave the labor market. So when you think about like these very fundamental structural beginnings of a mass paid labor market, we have to reflect on the impact that has had long term in the way that we view women's work and the way that we value women's work. Because often women's quote unquote work, or the work that women were clustered in, was just seen as an extension of their domestic work, which was not paid and not valued. So it was seen as really not valued, and no need to be highly compensated in the labor market because it was work women did for free anyway. So you've got to start at the beginning to really understand the structure of the paid labor market and how from its onset, women were disadvantaged because of these prevailing social mores of the time. So pay equity or inequity started to be addressed in, we don't have a lot of time, but at high level here in multiple stages. And one was, as unmarried women entered the paid labor market at the beginning of the end of the 19th century, we started to see dialogue around women and wages. World War I talked about marriage bars, they start to decrease. And minimum wages are actually starting to be addressed by governments because more women need to work because men are going to war. And there's a whole dynamic happening around gender and women in the labor market. World War II, we all know the infamous Rosie the Riveter. Women entered the labor market for the first time, married, unmarried, en masse, and were compensated less than their male counterparts would have been, but the justification there was because of the war effort. So we had to continue to pour money into the war. Interesting part here too is that the government established daycare centers that were government funded across the U.S. Well, in the States for the major weapons manufacturing is happening because they understood that women couldn't get to the labor market if they had extreme childcare duties. So I know it's still an issue we talk about today in terms of women's access to the labor market. And then, of course, a lot of advocacy. I'm jumping over a lot of stuff here, but in 1963, the Federal Equal Pay Act comes into effect across the U.S. It's basically saying, okay, we need to pay for equal pay for equal work. And I've talked a little bit about how this idea has transformed. So equal pay for the same work or equal pay for substantially the same work. And now we're having a conversation of equal pay for work of equal value, which is more of an idea of comparable worth, to say we're doing different jobs in a company, but they're valued differently. They're providing the same value, but they're compensated differently because they're gendered and because the jobs primarily done by women are valued gender biased way. So why do the gaps still persist? Because we've had legislation, we've had massive change. We've seen women enter the labor market in much higher numbers than ever before. We've seen gaps closing, but they're persisting. So a couple of things just to say, in 1960, the gender wage gap in the US was 59 cents on the male dollar. It's now 84 cents. So good news, it's closing. And this is because of, activism, obviously, changing social norms, the changing labor market, which I've really highly gone over, and then obviously targeted proactive legislation. So, governments are recognizing, and I'll talk about the trends that are emerging, which will affect, employers looking to hire. But when they're understanding that the gender wage gap is multifaceted and requires policy intervention, they're making huge strides to close it. So as I've sort of hinted at, the gender wage gap is actually reflecting how the market values and rewards certain types of work over others. And I mentioned, women's work has been erroneously categorized as merely an extension of their unpaid domestic roles. So we're talking about, nursing and cleaning and clerical work. And so these things are seen as less deserving of esteem and by extension, less deserving of compensation. So this is sort of, this trend or the devaluation of female dominated industries reflects, in my opinion, and what we've seen, a really systemic failure of the market to recognize the value of women's labor. So, these are some of the reasons why the gap is persisting. One, we talk about unpaid care work. So women, gaps in employment due to family care responsibilities. Women are still primarily responsible for unpaid care, which means it limits their ability to participate in the labor market and earn equitably to their male counterparts. Devaluation of female jobs, they've already hit on this. And, I get a lot of pushback on this that says, well, women have the choice about the type of jobs that they choose, and they choose these female dominated, lower paid jobs. But I think, personal preference is undoubtedly an influence, but we have to think about how societal norms, discriminatory practices actually exert profound influence. And it was an OECD report that I read that said by age 5, little boys and girls already have a gendered perspective of jobs. they talk about jobs in gendered language, and they have an understanding of what they can do. And at age like 4 and 5, a girl might say, I want to be a firefighter, a boy might say, I want to be a nurse, but by 7, it's completely segregated. So there's a lot happening around us that sort of bust that myth of, well, women choose lower paying jobs, which is sort of ridiculous. And then this idea of being underrepresented in leadership roles leads to all kinds of challenges, like, and you see this, I'm sure, day to day, women, if they step out of the labor market, they lose opportunity to raise a family or whatever, they lose opportunities for promotion, or if they have heavy responsibilities for unpaid care responsibilities, they lose opportunities, and other biases, right? So obviously other implicit or explicit gender bias plays into wage discrimination. And we see this when we use, we do analysis of the language used in job evaluations, like performance evaluations. And Kadie Ward, she has a platform in the US, Equity something, I forget, Pipeline to Equity, I think it's called. And she used AI to analyze like thousands of performance evaluations. And with 99% accuracy, the AI could detect if the candidate, without any name information, was male or female, because the language we use to talk about and evaluate women is different than the language we use to evaluate men, and it harms women in that process. So understanding that means we have a responsibility, well, especially as managers, to address it and change it. That's really high level on the history and sort of the dynamics that have brought us to where we are. I mean, the gap is closing, which is great. Still some challenges that we have to address in terms of the clustering of women and men into certain jobs and the discriminatory ideas around those jobs and what they're worth. So what's happening today? As I mentioned at the offset, the conversation is shifting from equal pay for equal work to pay equity, or the idea of comparable work. This idea that we have actually acknowledging that we value work differently or less because it's historically or stereotypically done by women. And we're also sort of, starting to question this idea or the meritocracy. Countless studies showed the economist Goldman's really famous blind interviews with the top 5 US symphony orchestras. I'm not sure if anyone remembers that study. It was quite famous, where basically, they did blind auditions. And in fact, like, they wouldn't even, if a woman was wearing high heels, but you couldn't see the candidate, but they were wearing heels and you could hear the heels, less likely to get in. But it was astounding when they took away all of the identifying factors, the level of women recruiting skyrocketed because they just took away the bias. And I'll never forget the CEO of Microsoft, Satya Nadella. He made a statement that women shouldn't ask for raises, but should just trust in karma for their rewards. And it just astounded me because I just could never imagine giving a man that advice. So it's out there, but what's happening today is it's coming to the forefront, and we're discussing it, and we're starting to see this highly segregated, gender segregated labor market shifting, which is really, really good. As a labor economist, as an economist, I'm keeping an eye on it, because we have seen actually a US-based longitudinal study looked at, as women move into male-dominated occupations, in fact, the wages start to drop, which sort of proves just the blatancy of gender discrimination in wages. So it's really interesting. And the reverse is true, actually, when if it's a female-dominated job, like computer programming in the waybacks was dominated by women. It was very menial work. As more men came into that space, the prestige and pay of the job went up. So it's fascinating to look at this to say, like, here's the evidence of the discrimination. So what's the good, the silver lining of that is we've had way more conversations about unconscious or implicit bias, and the way that influences how we make, how we compensate work in the labor market, and how our bias against women is more prevalent than we thought. And also, I should say, women here being intersectional by different types of identities, be it racialized or different level of ability or sexual orientation, that we're now gaining awareness that all of these factors impact the way that we evaluate and provide compensation. And so we're starting to see that trend and that decision making of, this is partially linked to inclusion initiatives, which I know in the US is now, having an interesting conversation. But I'll just share an anecdote of a story. I was part of the team that did the Bryant Park restoration in New York. I'm not sure if there's any New Yorkers on the call today. It was an amazing project. But after, it was pretty derelict, drug-ridden, just a horrible space, not safe. And there was like hundreds of millions going into reinvesting the property around it, the whole space. And finally, as the table started to turn, I asked the team, like, what was the thing that made it change? And they were shocked, and they said it was women. When women made up at least 55% of the park's patronage, crime dropped and cleanliness increased. And so it goes back to this, I don't like to use the economic argument, but it goes back to when you have women participating, women contributions being acknowledged and valued, we start to see really positive change. And stories like this is what's starting to push for that change and continue for that change, and for us to address, our perception of women's contributions and women's worth in the labor market, so we can be compensated fairly. Last thing I want to talk about is just emerging trends to address the pay gap. So, I think this is important for working women as a woman in the labor market, but also the talent professional, for you to know, what's happening. So I'm not sure if you have many Canadians on the call. I know you have a Canadian chapter here, but I'll talk a little bit about Canada, then we'll hop into the US, and I'll spend more time on the US stuff. But a big trend is legislation. Governments are, we're recognizing that, the Federal Equal Pay Act of 1963 is obviously not working in the US. In Canada, we had a similar act that was put in place about a decade earlier in the late 50s, also wasn't working. So governments are using other tools. So you can see Ontario says ON. That's where I am. You can see we have the most policy tools across Canada. And, research has shown, and I've done research with ILO and OECD on this, that when you recognize that the labor market is really complex, there's lots of dynamics, and you introduce different tools as an ecosystem, you can create really effective change. So you can see, much like the US is a republic, Canada is a federation. And so our provinces, equivalent to your states, have jurisdiction over labor market laws and labor regulation. So you can see they treat it all a little bit differently, and we won't get into this, but what is interesting is it is reflected in where the gender wage gap sits. So we'll spend a little bit more time looking at the US context. The Federal Equal Pay Act since 1963, as I've mentioned, but individual states have a really interesting patchwork of policy solutions. So whichever state you are in, I'm sure you are aware of what the laws are in terms of pay equity or asking for salary history or pay transparency laws. The emerging trend is really towards pay transparency, which I'm sure most of you are aware of, and salary bands. It'll be interesting to assess the impact. I know there's conversations around making those policies effective, because you're seeing disingenuous employers post pay bands from like 50,000 to 1 million, which is not an effective tool. So it'll be interesting to see how that shapes up. So I'm just trying to think of some examples to share with you in terms of where we've seen some really interesting progress. Or I guess you could say, pay transparency is going to be present probably in about 25 states by the end of the year, which is really interesting to see the population. It's in 12 right now, and about 12 more are looking at it and working on their legislation. People balk at legislation as a tool to address these things because they see government intervention as something really terrible. But we know that government intervention actually works when you have good policy. Mississippi, in fact, was the last state to introduce equal pay laws, and they didn't do that until 2022, which just like blows my mind. That was practically yesterday. And the state's wage gap sits at 77 cents on the dollar. California, on the other hand, has had equal pay laws since 1949. And that was actually 14 years before the federal Equal Pay Act. And their gender wage gap sits at 89%. So, and I think theirs is the smallest in the US, which is wonderful. The national average, as I said at the beginning of the presentation, is 84%. And New York is second at 88%. And New York has an incredible, also they have early adoption of equal pay laws. Utah probably fares the worst for women at 73 cents, but they have absolutely no laws, just very broad anti-discrimination laws. Massachusetts, I'm not sure if there's anybody here on the call from Massachusetts, but they're doing some really interesting work in this space. Currently, their gap is 86 cents. And they also introduced in 1945 equal pay laws. So it's really interesting to see states that have had legislation in place for the longest, you're seeing the pay gaps the smallest. So you're seeing, it's hard to make correlation and causation claims, but I think it's just an interesting trend to look at. Massachusetts was also the first state to actually prohibit employers for asking for a candidate's salary, which I was doing some research on them, and that saw a 5 to 6% wage increase on average and an 8% wage increase for women. So these types of laws and bans actually make a difference and support women in the labor market. There's a lot more that can be said, but I know we have a really short time together, and I left a few minutes for questions here, or we can just pop into the private session with the Talent Collective team. But I have a podcast called Level the Playing Field, where I have 2 seasons published, where we go into some really great detail on other topics. If you're interested in learning more and having a more in-depth look at some of the things I talked about, you can just go to topics and see which ones are of interest to you. You can find it wherever you listen to your podcasts or at leveltheplayingfield.ca. And thank you very much.
Kadie, that was so good. I learned more about pay equity and where things are at than I probably have my whole career in like the last 35 minutes. So thank you for that. Yeah, we have about 10 minutes or so for questions. So if you have questions, you can pop them in the chat and we can answer them, or you can obviously unmute. You don't have to turn your camera on to ask the question. You can just unmute. You can do camera on or off, whatever you prefer. But yeah, we'll make some space for questions here.
Sure. It's interesting to me. One thing I didn't talk about was it'd be so interesting for me to hear the feedback from even the women in the space here, because we often hear that the gender wage gap exists because women don't negotiate their salary. Obviously, the women on this call are involved in salary negotiation, and there's so much research either side. There's a lot of research that says, women do negotiate, they're just less likely to get what they ask for, or they're less likely to be taken seriously. And then there's research that says, well, they don't negotiate because they're socialized not to, they're socialized to be, polite and less aggressive. So I'd actually be interested in hearing from the folks on the call what their experience has been with that, because it's a huge, I guess, justification used. Like, it sort of puts the blame back on women to say, well, it's their fault, they don't negotiate. Which I think is a really, cheapskate answer. But we often hear that, and it's, research goes either way on saying, no, they do, or no, they don't.
So I have a story on.
Go ahead, please.
Go ahead.
Oh, okay, perfect. Hi, Kadie. It's Ankita.
Oh, hey.
Love the presentation. I actually have a story on that I find fascinating. So back when I was working in Big Four consulting, I found out, because my partner currently, he was in the same team at the time. So I was like, I knew his salary. And he had less years of work experience than me. He had a master's over me, but I had a designation. So I call that evened out. We were at the exact same level. We got promoted at the exact same time to manager. And I realized he was making 15K more than me and got a 5 to 10K higher bonus. And we were actually eligible for the exact same projects, exact same team. And so, and then through just, through friend circles and everything, also found out that on average, the men on the team were getting paid higher. And so I went to the partner on our team, who was a female partner and the only female partner. And I brought it up and I was like, hey, like what gives? Right? Like I know this. And she was like, yeah, I can confirm that the men on the team on average get paid higher. I was like, right, it's performance assessment. Like, what is going to be done about it? And the response was, well, women don't negotiate as much. Like I negotiated my salary. And so that experience to me really stuck because I didn't know if it was internalized bias in a way that was coming out, because to hear that from a female partner, whereas like a couple 2-3 years prior, I think it was um a male partner when I was much more junior who actually gave me a significant bump because he saw what was going on. So anyway, I found that to be really fascinating, where she was using that as an excuse and almost felt like, well, I made it here, so and this is what I had to do to make it here, so I'm not gonna pull other people up.
There is, yeah, and thank you for sharing that story. There's been a lot of conversations, especially, around the tall poppy syndrome, right? You may have heard that statement of like, so if a
Right,
woman
right.
gets too high, like we'll chop her down. And it's sort of like we are conditioned, like we are in it's zero sum for us because it's very limited in terms of the growth. So for women, I think that I feel like that is changing because we're talking about it more and we're recognizing it, that that's what's happening in the labor market. And we're seeing a trend. I'm seeing a trend in more women being supportive. And I think there is that attitude of, well, I had to suffer. I had to I've had women say that to me as well. Well, I had no one helping me. I was a mother. And it's like, okay, like, I'm sorry you had that experience. Would you like to help so somebody else doesn't have that experience? Right. And I think that that's a mindset shift that has to happen. And not putting the blame on women to say, like, yes, of course we have agency and we'll do the best we can, but recognizing that there's real biases, and if we don't support one another, it's not going to change. I think Talent Collective is a great example of that, right? Women coming together to share trade secrets, to support each other, so you can get past those experiences.
I also, hopefully it's okay to jump in here. I do recruiting internal and external, and across the board. I've been at my company for almost 4 years, and what I notice is the men ask and women just don't. And I have just noticed that, and I find it so fascinating. I think it's just a historical. They're
Yes.
used to asking, they can ask, women aren't used to it. But it does beg the question of, why don't women ask? Because men push it and ask all the time.
And there's a lot of research going into the socialization of boys and girls. And one piece of research that just struck me like so hard and related to this was there's a child psychologist that looked at how children use language and the development of language in children. And she observed when children start to use the word don't. And it's about the age 4. And for boys, they say, I don't care. And girls say, I don't know. That's how they intake. And I was like, oh my God, just the level of, at that age already, the level of self-confidence and self-assurance and self-knowledge is being like bred out through socialization or exposure to all the cultural things. And that just really struck me that, like, oh my God, we have to equal, like, we've got to go back to like kindergarten to build up or break down that socialization for boys and girls. Same with the OECD report, which shocked me that by age 5 to 7, kids have very cemented ideas of gender. And so that's part of the conversation we're having with women, is like, no, there is a socialization. You're penalized if you are aggressive or you speak up. Like, somebody will, like a friend of mine, she's a lawyer, and she made a post on LinkedIn about how another lawyer wrote her and said, watch your tone. And she was like, how many men have you said, watch your tone to? Like, just the way that we treat, or society treats women differently when they do stand up for themselves. Good silver lining for me is we're having the conversation now. Like, we're like, wait a minute, there's something happening in this dynamic that's not right. I think will take some time to shift, and for women to find that confidence to continue to ask and defend themselves in that space. And it's uncomfortable. It's not a comfortable thing to go through, right? We've been through it. It's really difficult, especially if you don't have the support of a manager or a mentor or a champion behind you. But we have to find, the ability to keep talking about it and pushing it and breaking down those sort of stereotypes for women. But thank you for sharing that.
Can I add in here real quick?
Yeah.
Is that okay? Carrie, I absolutely loved that point. Specifically, I mean, you're right. Men tend to be more assertive, and in terms of asking for pay increases and promotions, but also in terms of wage negotiation. I'm a huge advocate for teaching women how to do wage negotiations. You're in recruiting. I'm sure you can admire that as well. But in college, my capstone professor, he's in research. And so what we did for one of our capstone projects in HR was we broke down the pay equity gap, and we did a huge study on women versus men negotiating salaries. And so what turned out to happen is, just based on asking for a little bit more money up front, and then also asking for promotions, increase their wages by around 20%. And if we look at it, we have, a little bit over 20%, but around a 20% pay gap. And so he's like, look, we can literally, through data and numbers, show that pay gap, a huge portion of it is due to women's assertiveness and comfortability negotiating and asking for raises.
It's so true. And we hired, I work for I'm the commissioner of the pay equity office, right? And our job classifications, like every job classification, has ranges. And so we have some people in the same job classification at different stages of the range, because there's an acceptable, tenure, level of education, level of experience, all that stuff you guys know. But we had a scenario where we hired two women at the exact same time for the exact same job, and we made them the exact same job offer. And one came back and negotiated. One took the job right away, didn't negotiate. She was a new Canadian, probably very, just grateful to get a job. And, she just took the job right away, so happy. And then the other one came back and negotiated a higher salary. And the hiring manager came to me and said, I don't feel right, giving this woman the contract, knowing that I just negotiated a higher salary for the other. She said, I want to go back and offer her the same salary. And I was like, and obviously it's, as an employer, you're looking at your budgets, but we had a really long talk about it. And she was like, this, and it was really like the hiring manager was really just upset. And I said, you know what, it's whatever, we'll make the budget work. Yes, go back and give her that salary, or offer her. And it wasn't massive. It wasn't a huge difference, but it made such a difference for the hiring manager. And I thought it was a moment to lead by example, to say, you know what, this is the right thing. They are literally the same profile of person that we're hiring. So I think it takes, you guys are in a position to do that, right? To go to the employer or whoever you're working with and say, this isn't right. This could come back to kick us in the ass, depending on the laws in your state. There's definitely a legal justification to say there's an expectation of equal pay for equal work, and we have to do this. Because it was, I thought it was so great for my hiring manager to come to me and to go to bat for that candidate and say, she didn't feel comfortable, and she was like, this is where we're at. And we made the choice to go back to her, which is so rare, right? I'm sure she probably fell off her chair, was like, well, you're coming back with more money. But we just felt that we had to live our values in that moment. And so we did it. And I think that's where, hiring managers need to have these honest conversations with themselves. And I know we have bottom line, we have budgets for salary, wages, and benefits, but we have to think about our values and how we want that reflected in our compensation plans as well. Well, that's a great, Jadlyn, I think it was. Thank you for sharing that.
Well said, Kadie. Thank you so much for all of the questions from the audience, for attending. Thank you for your time. This actually wraps up part one of our workshop. So if you are a Talent Collective member, you are welcomed and encouraged to attend for the 30-minute exclusive Q&A with Kadie to get all of your nitty-gritty questions answered about pay equity. I'm personally really excited to get to my questions, Kadie, here in a few minutes. So with that, I will be shutting down this Zoom. If you are a Talent Collective member, as a reminder, go back to your registration in the Talent Collective platform to find the second link that you should be clicking into in order to join us for that session. So pop on here in just a few minutes and we'll see you all soon. Thanks again, Kadie.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.
Thanks.